Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Happy Tuesday. You're doing well. As we always do, as you settle in, let us know your role, where you're zooming in from. And because of today's topic, what's your favorite way you support your mental health? So in the chat, open it up if you haven't done so already as you settle in. Let us know your role, where you're coming from, as well as what's your favorite way to support your mental health. The group were just talking about this before. We're enjoying about like what is it that they like to do to support their mental health. We were talking about being outside. We were talking about being active, running, playing basketball, going to the beach. Depending on where you live, you might have different activities that you enjoy. Also, here the weather is not great in all parts of the country, so if you got some struggles with your Wi-Fi, we get it. You got team members trying to make sure they're tethered in, supported. But let us know. Hopefully you got good, clear Wi-Fi, where you're from, what's your role, and what's your favorite way to support your mental health. Thanks for those that are getting us started. Got some folks dropping in. Shelly got us started. She's at a virtual school in Kansas. Being outside. Yeah, definitely being outside. I love to be out and the mountains, camping, riding bikes, skiing, whatever it is, outdoors. I typically enjoy it. Some folks joining from Indianapolis. Good to have you here. A drummer, absolutely. Playing the drums. But play music always impressed me. My son, for context, is in fourth grade, and today is actually his last day of fourth grade, which is exciting. But he's learned to play the cello, and I just always get impressed by people that can read music, turn those notes into something that sounds really beautiful. Absolutely. Well, welcome in, everybody. We're glad that you're here and joining from all over the country as usual, which is always so fun to see. We've got a great topic, especially this time of year, because we recognize folks are starting to wrap up. It may not be your last day as an educator, but maybe it is. But it's in your last month, I'm sure, as you're starting to wind things down. But we also want to be thinking about what is it that we actually get to do as we wrap up and keep ourselves mentally well as we go into summer. And I started to think about like where I might want to go. So yet again, another opportunity to think about being outside and just another way for us to connect here in this virtual space. So if you had to think about it and you had two things in one person you'd bring to this location, let us know in the chat what those things would be and who you're bringing. I often think about like, how would I get there? And there's the long hike in to Machu Picchu that you can do. Multiple different directions, but I'd probably be bringing a backpack and some good shoes. And then who would I take? That's always a good question. I think I'm going to take my son because I think he'd find it just absolutely amazing, all those terraces. But let us know too, if you like to get out and you'd go do this, what are you taking with you? Who you bringing? Thanks, Teresa. Bring a camera and some water for sure. And absolutely bring a camera to capture those moments. That's an essential. I love it. Backpack, snacks, maps. Yeah, I don't want to get lost on the way. Maybe some sunscreen and umbrella. Bringing our moms. Yeah, absolutely. Walter, he's bringing a llama. I'm not sure what we do with the llama on the trek, but maybe you ride it. I don't know. Maybe shear some wool, stay warm. But absolutely love it. Thanks for connecting in that way and letting us know like where might you go and who might you go with is something that we like to think about. Who would you be bringing with you and what do you want to enjoy that time with, whether it be a person that's connected to you in a meaningful way. So really quick, just to get us going, introduction. My name's Corey Notestein. I'm the Chief of Staff here at Character Strong. And today we're talking about 10 ways to prioritize your mental health as an educator. Now, these can apply across the board. You don't just have to be an educator to do these things. And in fact, you can share them with your friends, your family, across lots of different sectors of industry. But ultimately, we're trying to figure out how is it that we actually have better mental health, or how is it that we have good well-being? And we're going to talk about mental health in general. How do we define it? And then also, like, what are some of the things that we can do to not only prioritize it, but like actual tangible things that I could walk away with today and go do tomorrow, this evening, that help increase my overall mental well-being. And so that's what we're going to get into. We have some objectives, as we always do. The first being, we're going to talk about 10 strategies to increase mental health. We're going to get into those. We're also going to identify specific ways that we can actually prioritize it and create a plan around it, especially as we head into, like we were talking about, the last days of school and into the summer. Hopefully, we're going to find some time to relax and do some of the things you weren't able to do during the academic year, because I know educators are spending more than just those school bell hours working, but in the evenings, in the morning to prep. So how can you take advantage of that time during the summer to enjoy some of these things and get yourself back in the right state of mind for the next academic year? And then at the end, I'm going to ask, and throughout the time, please, if you have a thought related to a resource, an idea, or a practice that you currently engage in to support your mental health, drop it in the chat. Today, think about this as a learning network, right? We're all here together. We've got lots of ideas. Many of us have been practicing different types of mental health, whether it be just different philosophies, whether it be practices, whether it be tools that you engage with, or even just general activities that you think really boost your mental health. Don't forget to drop them throughout our time together. I think it's absolutely essential to have a bank of these resources so you can come back to and use at any given point in time, because the reality is this, and maybe you agree with this or it resonates with you, is that you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So we can't be asking educators to give more to others than what they currently are giving to themselves, or people are putting into that bank, so they can actually feel energized to be able to move forward. Because we got to take care of ourselves, not just because it's important for self-care. And I think it's beyond that. It's more about how we take care of ourselves so we can take care of our communities. And oftentimes when we take care of our communities, it equally means we're taking care of ourselves. And if it's not ourselves that are taking care of ourselves, we're getting support along the way from the relationships that we currently have. And we'll talk about a little bit more about like the importance of relationships in our overall well-being. But as we get started, let's define what we mean by mental health. This comes from the Department of Human Services. Here's a definition. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. And when you think about that definition, you might think, well, I define mental health slightly differently, or I like this other definition. So from your vantage point, whether the role that you serve in school as a teacher, psychologist, social worker, counselor, it could be an administrator, it could be a district administrator, whatever your role is or your vantage point is, what do you think is missing from this definition? Do you think it has to do with like resiliency is missing from this? And we'll see different definitions that actually call that out explicitly. Like mental health is not only about those things, but it's also developing resiliency over time. But from your vantage point, what do you think is missing to date from this definition? Now, it's a couple of years old, and I think like anything else, definitions are constantly evolving. But Walter, I appreciate you getting us kicked off there. I think it's missing have the tools and our capability to handle challenges and surprises. Absolutely. Like, how do we be adaptive? How do we respond to the stimuli in our environment that can help us actually show up in the way that we ultimately want to show up? Stephanie says, I like the ability to empathize with others and not being immediately drained from that empathy is a part of it. Absolutely. Like having empathy for ourselves and for others is a necessity when we think about our overall well-being. Yeah. And talking about physical health and the effects of mental health. We're going to get into some of that. Equally, like Kevin's talking about how we recharge our energy. Like, where is it that we actually go to, both mentally and physically, to recharge ourselves? Daily, weekly, monthly, and throughout the year. How is it that we actually are putting stuff in, filling the cup up, so we actually have the capability of engaging with others in a way that is really meaningful for us, but also meaningful for them? So we can think about mental health in a couple of ways, but one of the ways that we'd like to think about it is inclusive of not only the things we just defined for ourselves, but also how is it that we actually think about this work on a paradigm of what you'll see here is flourishing all the way down to floundering, right? So when we think about our mental health, it's not just that it's free of mental illness, right? So if we think about this paradigm, if it's free of mental illness, but it also has to be inclusive of the things that we were just talking about, right? It has to be inclusive of tools and practices, but also has to be inclusive of empathy and resources and supports for us to actually being mentally well. And when we think about like flourishing from this paradigm here of where we have strengths in relation to the difficulties or problems that we're experiencing throughout their environment or our lives. Typically, what happens when individuals are flourishing, that they actually have a high level of number of skills, resources, tools currently available to them, and they actually have a lower, or they're managing the difficult challenges that are coming to them with those tools, right? And so we find ourselves in this upper quadrant or on this continuum of floundering or flourishing when we have a good set of tools at our disposal. We also can actually have the ability to have a lot of tools, but also be dealing with a lot of difficulties in our life. And also, when that happens, we might be struggling, but we're content. We have the resources we can pull from. We often talk about this here at Character Strong too, is like, how are we doing at work? How are we doing at home? And do I have the resources to manage both? Right? When you think about it that way, sometimes we have the resources at work or we have the resources at home, but not both of them. But when we have resources for both, times can be difficult and we can persevere through them and we can develop resiliency over time. The other thing to think about is when we have a low set of tools or strengths in relation to our mental well-being and a low level of challenges, we're vulnerable, right? It doesn't take much more to push us over into this other quadrant of floundering, right? So when we don't have the tools and we're not being challenged by our environments, we're vulnerable in the sense that it doesn't take much to push us over into a space where we're actually floundering and not able to actually deal and cope with what's happening. And now you might be wondering, like, well, what does it mean to actually flounder or flourish? Well, this paradigm really comes into these definitions. So when we talk about floundering, it really refers to a state where an individual is struggling significantly with their mental health, right? They can manifest in several ways, including emotional distress, functional impairment, low self-satisfaction, poor physical health, right? And we might have found ourselves at any given point in our lives in a space where we're floundering, right? It's not because we live there for a moment that we stay there, right? Because it's a continuum, we can fluctuate across it over points in time. We develop new tools, we experience new challenges, and as we continue to do that pattern of develop skills and tools while also experiencing challenges, we develop resiliency. We recognize that we can overcome hard things and start to move our way out of this floundering and up further and further to the flourishing paradigm, or that further end of the spectrum. And when we talk about flourishing, what we're talking about is a state of optimal mental health and well-being. It's not just the absence of mental illness, but the presence of positive attributes, right? And this is what we're starting to talk about. They include like positive emotions, engagement, relationships, purpose and meaning, accomplishments, right? And resiliency over time. So that when we start to experience this paradigm, we can start to chart ourselves like, where is it that we're on the paradigm? Or in fact, where are our friends or our colleagues or our peers? And how is it that we can equally support? Because if we're supporting only ourselves, then too little, if we're only focused on ourselves and not focused on our colleagues or peers, that unfortunately that individual that's floundering will impact our flourishing moments. And so it becomes really optimal for us to actually not only work on ourselves, but to support our peers or colleagues or our family. And so there's another way to think about this, and we'll spend a little bit more time in this space and then get into some of the practices. But when you think about this mental health or mental well-being, there's lots of ways to slice it. And there's lots of different models for it. There's also one that's talking about this multi-dimensional model for mental health. And it actually breaks up mental health into multiple parts. And I like it because it makes us think about there isn't just one piece of well-being that's necessary for us to find ourselves in the flourishing category, right? If we're emotional well, it means that we're experiencing joy and life satisfaction and have a positive affect, right? This isn't the chronic idea where the chronic positivity, right? Where we're actually, or excuse me, toxic positivity, where we're actually thinking about like those people that always see or always project the positive side of things, even in light of the negative. It's okay to experience the negative side of life, right? It's okay to be in that space, but when we're actually flourishing, we're thinking about our emotional well-being and experiencing joy even during the difficult times. And some of that is just a cognitive shift. And we're going to talk about cognitive reframing, how that can help us start to experience greater life satisfaction even when things are challenging. We also know we have to have psychological well-being, right? Where we have self-acceptance, personal growth, purpose in life again, right? Environmental mastery. How do we get better about navigating the environment around us? We have autonomy, we have positive relationship with others. When you think about psychological well-being, it makes me think a lot of David Pink's work, and mostly in his book Drive, where he's talking about all individuals and in the working environment as a professional specifically, but I think it applies to our personal life as well, is that they want to have autonomy, they want to have purpose, and they want to have mastery over the thing that they're doing. Right? If we can start to develop those three things over time, people feel psychologically well. Also, we want to talk about social well-being, right? Social acceptance. We're creatures that like to engage in social activities. We like to be seen, heard, and understood by others, right? We're social creatures. So how is it that we have social acceptance where we feel like we belong? Social actualization, social contributions, right? Social coherence, like how do we actually mesh together? And also social integration. How do we integrate ourselves in different environments, and whether that be at work, whether it be in our home, whether it be in community groups, how do we come together inside of that and feel as though we generally belong and have a connection to that group? And then last, professional well-being, right? I don't think we can exclude the professional side of things because it plays such a big part of who we are. Sometimes we maybe over-index on our professional identity at the cost of our personal identity. And how do you find the equilibrium there? But when we have professional well-being, we have, again, purpose, autonomy, our work environment's healthy, and we're working towards professional growth. When we add all those things together, when we start thinking about them across the spectrum, they start to add up to a general overall well-being. Like to be well, we need all four parts. And when we have all four parts that come together, right, then we're able to engage and perform well, not just in work, but also in life. And I like to think about it when we add these things together with a supportive environment, plus the mindsets and skills that are necessary to grow and adapt, then we will be well over time. So in the chat, let's do this. It's an either or option here, right? So where do you see your colleagues currently struggling the most, whether that be in their psychological well-being, their social well-being, and so forth? Or if you're brave, because we won't know which way you're answering it here in the chat, where do you struggle the most? And I'll just pull them back up for a moment for you here. When you think about social well-being, physical well-being, professional well-being, or emotional well-being, like where do you see your colleagues or yourself struggle the most? This is an opportunity to be vulnerable in a different way than we were talking about, to come out there and talk about like, where is it that I'm actually struggling? Because we are here. We're all collectively here trying to solve the same thing. How do we prioritize our well-being? And people are talking about like our physical well-being. Yep. Emotional. All right. Often turns to emotional. Yeah. Struggle with my work-life balance, which affects me emotionally and sometimes physically. I sometimes find that like I can't do all four of these well at the same time. I don't know about some of you. Like when I finally dial in like my physical well-being and my professional well-being and my emotional well-being, like my social well-being suffers. Like I'm giving all the energy to three of the four, and I can't ever do all of them well. Maybe that resonates with you out there, and maybe if someone has an answer for how to do four all well at the same time, that'd be great. I'm not saying that there's not a continuum. It's not like a yes or a no option here, but it's like the continuum of how well am I doing these things, or where am I exerting my energy the most? And sometimes it's a good indicator, like when you start to feel one dip down lower, that you need to actually engage in it. Recently, I recognized that I haven't been connecting with my friends as often, and I was engaged in work. I was working out. I feel like I have a good emotional well-being, but I really just wasn't engaged relationally as much as I wanted to. And I noticed it. I could feel that underlying hum, that low frequency of that I wasn't socially connected. And it was starting to like bubble up. I'm like, I think I need to get out and connect with my friends. And so I start picking up the phone and reaching out. Like, how do you start to pay attention to those things? How are you mindful enough to recognize when those things are running lower than they should? Now, when we start to think about like our own personal behaviors, like in relation to those four types of well-being, we have to understand that our behaviors are connected to a couple things. They're connected to us individually, but they're also connected to us through our environment. And what I mean by that is that a person is made up of a set of characteristics, right? Their background, their experiences, our mindset, whether it's open or closed, and the skills and the tools that we currently have to navigate our environment, right? Sometimes our skills are not as well developed yet to meet the demands of our environment, right? This is where like resiliency and challenge comes in. But we also have to take into account that our environment is equally impacting our behaviors and who we are. And so when we think about the environmental factors at play around our mental health and well-being, do we feel safe? Do we feel supportive? Do we feel that the environment is predictable or nurturing? And when we combine the person and the environment, we start to create a set of behaviors. Now, we can think about these behaviors in two specific ways. We can think about the ones that are from the inside or the outside in or the inside out. And what I mean by that is from the outside in is when we think about the healthy working conditions that cultivate the belonging, the well-being, and the engagement of educators, right? So when you think about that environmental context, what are the conditions necessary for us to be well? Because there's some things that we have control over, then there are some things that we don't. And we talk about our own locus of control. But we actually do have some things that we can do for our educational environments or our home environments that if we created safety, created a general sense of predictability, then all of a sudden that allows us to be able to function in that space with a greater sense of psychological safety that leads to personal well-being with some of the skills and tools that we have. Now, that inside out approach is really thinking about the social emotional competencies or tools or resources that we currently have available to us, right? And how is it that we apply those in the environment that allows ourselves to feel psychologically safe? Or specifically, how is it that we're emotionally well? How is it that we're socially well, right? So those two approaches really help us think about how is it that we're going to tackle our mental health? Are we going to change the environment that we're in, or are we going to focus our energy on developing our own skills and competencies? And I think this paradigm is really helpful when we think about the things that we can actually control and prioritize in our own well-being. But I have a question for you before we jump into some ideas about how we can do this. If you had to answer this question or these sets of questions about how are educators doing in your current environment, whether that's your school or your district or your peers that are in other systems, if they had to come through here and actually rate your environment, right? Where do you think they would actually rate it as a yes, somewhat, or not really? So when I think about this, like, are our educators currently emotionally well? Do they feel valued and appreciated? Do they feel engaged? Do they feel like they have collective efficacy? Do they feel like they have psychological safety and trust? Asking ourselves these questions can help think about what are the environmental things that we might be able to do as a peer, a colleague, as someone that might be responsible for this in their system. And if you can't say yes to these things, then we recognize that we still have work to do, and that's okay. But I'm curious in the chat, if you had to identify one area that these things are not really in place for your environment, would it be that we don't really have emotional well-being in our work environment? Or is it the case where, no, we don't really have collective value or appreciation for all team members? if you could just drop it in the chat, like where do you think your system is needing support? Is it around engagement? Is it around collective efficacy? Is it around psychological safety? And you might be asking yourself, like, I don't know all these terms definition. That's okay. I can give them to you at another time. But where do you just think right now where your system is? And Teresa, thanks for getting us started there. Definitely around psychological safety and trust. Rebecca's saying collective efficacy, right? So when you think about collective efficacy, how is it that people feel that they have the ability to carry out the things that they need to carry out in their day, whether it be initiatives or interventions or instructional practices? Do they feel they have the current tools and abilities to do so? And around psychological safety, do people feel like they can elevate their concerns in a space where it won't be held against them, right? So it's a collective experience around psychological safety. Trust is developed through that process. And one way to also start to develop trust and relationship is through what Simone just said there, is developing the ability to be appreciated or valued. So those are things that we recognize that we can have control over, that we can apply to our environment that may not be directly related to ourselves, because it's going to take both things, the environment, the change, and working towards the growth in ourselves. So when we think about this, I'm just going to list a few of these strategies. We're not going to get into them because we got the 10 that we already promised we're going to talk about. But because you're going to gain access to this, I just wanted to like list a few of these things and what they look like. So when we think about individual strategies inside the environment, these are some of the things that we can control, right? We can talk about self-care, therapeutic, and lifestyle choices, right? We can talk about nutrition and spending time outdoors. We can talk about physical activity. We can talk about sleep. And those are all things that we personally can control that contributes to the environment that we're a part of. And then also social emotional competencies, right? We were talking about this as well. How is it that we actually clarify our values and commit ourselves to them? How is it that we reframe our inner dialogue, right? Where do we have control and where do we don't? How do we regulate our emotions? Because all of us become dysregulated at some point when we're triggered by certain things in our environment. How we manage that actually has a lot to do with how we think than how we behave, right? And then that allows us to actually get into a good flow of how do we regulate ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about practicing mindfulness and practicing gratitude. Equally, there's some organizational strategies that we were just referencing, right? Around psychological safety. How do we create efficacious educators? How do we acknowledge and recognize people? How do we help educators find joy in the job again? I feel like a big one right now, right? Maybe the idea that summer is right on there on the brink of happening, that we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but how do you experience that joy throughout the duration of the year? And there are some low points. We all know them. They come around November, they show up again in the January, February timeframe, right? And there's these natural low points that we have to take into consideration. How do we collectively boost efficacy, right? How do we have clear and visible priorities within our system? And then how do we provide access to additional supports? Those are some just general strategies. We're going to dial in and get really specific on things that you can actually do yourselves, whether it be around the individual strategies or the organizational strategies, because ultimately we're trying to figure out how do we solve the problem of mental health or mental well-being. Well, first we have to do something where we have to define what the problem is for ourselves. And like, have we had an opportunity to do like we just did, the quick self-assessment of how do we feel about the environment? Or do we do it for ourselves? Like, do we actually get in there and really look internally about where does the problem exist for me currently? And that one's always feels like a little bit harder. I don't know about you all, but looking inward can sting a little bit. But how do we do it in a way that once we do, we know what we can do next? And understanding what the root cause of that problem is allows us to actually start to develop a plan for ourselves and then enact the plan and start thinking about how is it that we're going to boost? Maybe it's our social well-being. Maybe it's our emotional well-being. Maybe it's our physical well-being, right? Or our psychological well-being. Where is it that we're going to focus our energy towards? And what is the plan that's going to get us there? And I don't know about you, but there's certainly no magic wand to get there, and there's no silver bullet to pull this thing off. But there are things that we can remind ourselves about. We talk a lot about this at Character Strong, that we need to be reminded more than need to be taught. The reality is, some of the things I'm going to mention, you already know. It's about how is it that you prioritize it. We're going to talk at the very end about how you can make a quick, actionable plan for some backwards mapping, right? How do we tie in what we know to work in other environments for our own personal lives, right? So some of these you'll think, I know these. I know you know them. Sometimes it's a matter of like, how do you actually go about doing them daily and consistently? Sometimes some of these practices you can't do every day. Sometimes it's once a week or once a month. But what is it that allows you to pull from a robust menu or bank of resources to help yourself and your overall well-being? So we got 10. And one of them is a little bit more than 10 because I snuck in like 3 into one of them. So you're getting like 13 just as a awareness of that. But that's okay. We want to make sure that you have lots of resources walking away as we do this. And so what I'd ask for you to do is, one, we're going to get in here and I'm going to list them in 10, and I'm going to show you some different practices related to them. And at the end of each one, I'll call it out. I just want to prompt and cue you to be ready for it. I'd love for you, if you have an idea related to one of these, that you share it in the chat. I know someone will resonate with it. They're going to probably write it down. They're going to probably put it on a sticky note and slap it on their screen or their monitor and come back to it. I know lots of people do lots of different reminder techniques. Maybe it's they set a reminder on their calendar to do that thing. And I want folks to walk away with as many resources as possible today. And so we're going to collectively share them with each other. I'm going to share some, you're going to share some, and that way we walk away with a full cup of resources. So let's jump in, right? The power of gratitude, right? Gratitude's really interesting because it's actually something that you can do that's free. A lot of these things are free, but what's really great about it is it doesn't take much to do it. It just takes an opportunity for you to pause and think about what you're grateful for today. One of the things I used to do every time I started a meeting in the department that I used to run in a school district here in Colorado Springs, which is where I'm located, is we start every department meeting with, what are you grateful for today? Right? And it was just a simple question. And what it allowed me to do is, one, hear what was going on in people's lives, but also two, remind ourselves that there's lots of positive things coming our way. Because when our mental well-being is low, it's easy to resonate and find all the things that aren't working for us, right? It's almost like they collect, become magnetized to us, right? And so if we start to recognize that's where our mindset is, the opposite of that is being grateful for the things that we do have and we're being supported by. So how do you do this daily and weekly? Because what the research would point to is that gratitude has an immense power to actually promote positive emotions, right? So such as joy, enthusiasm, life satisfaction. It also has the ability to reduce envy, right? And resentment and regrets. And over time, when we actually start to identify the things that we're grateful for consistently, it builds resilience, because there's no doubt that each of us is going to face something challenging. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, right? And so by having some daily practices in place that help us think about, even in the darkest of times, something that you're grateful for, allows you to start to peel back and look for the silver lining in moments, right? What can we learn and glean from those challenging times that help us for the next one that we'll experience? Now, Character Strong actually has a few of these things already inside of our Character Strong gym. So I just want to highlight a few things. So if you're not familiar with the Character Strong gym, it's a bank of resources and activities for educators, either with students, with staff, with administrators, or families. And I just pulled a few of them to show us because I thought they were really great practices. So this comes from the character dares that are specifically for staff, and it's an opportunity that happens each day. So think about it this way. At the end of each day this week, send one email or encouragement and or gratitude to one member of your staff, right? Simply send a sentence or two with your positive thoughts, then hit send in less than a minute. I can't tell you how many times our team does something like this at a training, and randomly I'll get a text from a colleague that just says something that they're grateful for towards me. And while I know they're doing it because they're in a training, it still feels really good because the specificity by which they name matters, right? They're not just saying, I'm grateful for you, Corey, right? They explicitly tell me what they're grateful for and why is it impacting them, right? So not only is it something that you can do where you think about like, what are you grateful for today in the sense of what came your way, what did you experience, but also you can actually give gratitude towards somebody else and how they're impacting your life. And by sharing it, not only are you impacting your own well-being, but you're impacting somebody else. Here's just another example. It's from our staff one as well. It's called a gratitude list. And so at the end of each week, and this is related to students, you can swap it out with anything other. It could be family, it could be peers, it could be colleagues, and so forth. You and your students should write down the first 2 to 3 things that come to mind that you're grateful for. For you, think of something that made you grateful to be an educator, right? So we're all educators, regardless of our role. We're all supporting the learning of students. What are you grateful for? Just list them, 2 to 3 things, right? And then when you have that, share the list, right? It's always really important to actually share that with somebody, whether it be someone close to you, whether it be someone that you're doing this challenge with, because I think it really allows for you to actually identify, oh yeah, there are really positive things happening in my environment. And I love that Sheila was in here in the chat. She stated that I'm starting to do it in my car ride on the way to work. When it becomes a habit, you'll never not do it. It just comes to mind automatically now. Just finding a specific time of the day that it fits naturally in really is helpful. I love that, right? So it's just building a new habit on the way to work, right? Just ask yourself, what am I grateful for today? And just that slight change of perspective allows us to feel a positive burst of emotion. So here's the thing. We're wrapping up here on the first one, right? Where we're talking about the power of gratitude. Maybe write a gratitude practice that you participate in the chat, just like Sheila did. Love that. Uh, if you have others, feel free. Could be something where every morning on my mirror in my bathroom, I have a reminder that says gratitude, right? Just stuck there. And it prompts me and reminds me to do it. Or I set a calendar reminder for myself, right? When I get into the office at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., whatever the start time is for you, that's the first thing on your calendar is like to be grateful for something. And I love Wendy. Thanks for dropping something in there in the chat. As we move on to the next practice, it really is about our physical and nutritional health. We started talking a little bit about that on the individual strategies, but we're going to bring it back around again. And I love this quote: the best exercise is the one you do, right? So often it becomes where I didn't get a morning exercise in, or I wasn't able to do something after work or before work, and it's getting close to time for bed. And I haven't done anything. I've been sitting maybe part of my day or a lot of my day, and while I've been walking around the classroom, it's not something that I'm necessarily wanted to do as my physical activity. So how is it that we can actually aim for a window of time? There's a lot of research around how can I actually just be active for 30 minutes a day? And what does that look like? Now, I recognize a lot of educators that like, Corey, I'm on my feet more than 30 minutes a day. And you're probably right, right? But there other ways that you want to be active. And an example, like, right, sometimes the housekeeping around my house is the way I keep active. It's out mowing the lawn, it's out gardening, it's out taking out the trash, or it's picking up around the house. Just that physical movement of being active is sometimes enough to be a step in the right direction. So the best exercise really is the thing that you do. And it's a good reminder too that when we start thinking about our nutrition, think about it as fuel, right? So when we start thinking about how we eat and what we eat, remind ourselves is that the food that we consume is the power that we have to give. And so if we put garbage in, we're going to get garbage out, right? And we can talk a lot about nutritional practices, and by no means am I a nutritionist. And so I wouldn't sit here and pretend to give you lots of different types of nutritional strategies, but some that really come to mind that are simple and easy to think about, not maybe always simple and easy to do, because I have a pure love for sugar. It becomes really hard. I was telling Tia, who was one of my teammates, I was trying to cut it out. It's really hard. It's actually, sugar is the most addictive substance actually in our environments, more so than any other type of drugs that exist. Refined sugars are challenging for our system. And so when we start to pull back from them, our bodies respond. And so how do you think about limiting refined sugars? I'm not talking about the ones that exist in our fruits and our vegetables, talking the ones that actually get added in, so those included sugars. Also, when you think about hydration, I'm not talking about drinking a gallon of water every day, right? I'm just thinking about like, what is it something that you can do to feel hydrated? There's both ends of the spectrum right now, like how much hydration is the most beneficial for you. The reality is you've got to be hydrated, right? Dehydration is actually a good indicator that's actually going to cause other problems like sleep and actually attention and other things. So how is it that you're at least mindful, at least starting your day with a single glass of water, right? Before you get up and do anything else, the first thing to do is get a glass of water, consume it, think about it as a way that you actually jumpstart your day. And the other thing when I think about like physical and nutritional health, because I'm not a nutritionist, because I'm not a physician, you should schedule an annual visit, right? Schedule a physical, get checked out, make sure that you're actually taking care of your body because there's a lot of things that actually are byproducts of our body not performing at its best, right? And it's because a lot of that is potentially that there's actually some underlying issue with our overall physical health. And getting checked out regularly and consistently annually makes sure that we're at least taking some natural precautionary steps or preemptive steps to actually being physically or nutritionally well. And just one more fun fact related to this topic is that when we think about our gut bacteria, right, what's interesting about it from my perspective is that 90%, 95% of our overall supply of serotonin, which is actually the thing that affects our mood and our sleep and the pain tolerance that we have, comes directly from the breaking down of nutrients in our gut. So if we're putting junk in and expecting to get high performance outcomes, well, that's probably not going to happen, right? It's probably going to impact our sleep. It's going to impact our mood. And just think when we don't have the proper nutrition, how we feel. We feel sluggish. We actually feel like we don't have the energy to go about doing our day and our work. So how is it that we actually start thinking about food, not just the things that taste good to us, but they think about them as the life source for that powers our mind and our body to do the things that we naturally want to do. And then, yeah, I love that joke there from Stephanie. But other things related to hydration, nutrition, our overall physical activity. It could mean that you're getting outdoors. It could mean that you're scheduling the day to go on a hike. What are those things that you can practically do, put on your schedules and go and do to be in the spaces that are meaningful for you, where you can get 30 minutes of physical activity a day. So if you have other ideas, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm always looking for another good type of physical activity. Many of you, I'm sure, are picking up pickleball these days. What else? What else can you do to get outside? I love any good examples of things that people might do to keep themselves active. So let's move on to number 3, mindset and positive thinking, right? Growth mindset isn't just for students, it's actually for all of us. Our minds are malleable and has a lot of neuroplasticity at all ages, and so we want to keep it active, right? And we want to actually start using our mind to its greatest potential. And one thing that we can do is actually think about it from a cognitive reframing perspective. When I'm talking about cognitive reframing, I'm really talking about this cognitive triangle, like our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings. One of the biggest things that you can start to do is start to notice it, right? I don't know about you. Sometimes I can get stuck in some repetitive thoughts. I can create some false narratives for myself that actually impact my behaviors and then ultimately impact the way I feel, right? So just some quotes there. Like if I have negative thoughts about something, right? All of a sudden, then my behaviors reflect my thoughts. And when my behaviors reflect my thoughts, I start to feel certain ways about it. So it might be that this is unbearable, right? And then all of a sudden, I unintentionally exhibit behaviors that lead to more negative culture and climate. And because that negative culture and climate exists, I feel stressed, exhausted, guilty, and resentful, right? So we want to stop that cognitive process, right? And one way we can do that is through cognitive reframing, right? There are helpful thoughts and there are unhelpful thoughts. Now, I know all of us have had unhelpful thoughts at times. I know I have. And I also know there's a better way of doing it. Sometimes I just have to remind myself, and it maybe takes us all the way back to the first thing about being grateful, right? but what are the unhelpful thoughts and how do I notice them? Right? Are they inconsistent with my personal values? Right? That's one way to pause. People might talk about this as mindfulness, but really actually thinking about your thoughts, metacognition, right? Thinking about your thoughts. And when you recognize that they're unhelpful, how do we shift that narrative, right? How do we start to move towards something that's more consistent with our values? And it might look something like this, right? This is the notice and reframe, right? This is tough, but we are tough. Sometimes it's that statement of, I can do hard things, right? When I think about that, I can do hard things, all of a sudden my behaviors change. If I can do hard things, it means I can persevere. It means I can persist a little bit longer. It means I can actually push through the discomfort. And when I push through a little bit of discomfort, all of a sudden my mood starts to shift. I have more energy. I feel better. I feel more confident about the thing. It's all about noticing, right? The break that continuous cycle of unhelpful thoughts. If anyone else has some other ideas on how they actually do this, let me know. One way I used to think about it, and whether it's healthy, I think it's healthy. You'll hear why I say it. I used to sometimes just wear like a little rubber band around my wrist. When I had a negative thought, I would just actually give a slight, stretch of the rubber band, right? Just to like, hey, wake up. That's a negative thought. And what that would do is just act as a trigger for me. Like, oh, that's a negative thought. I should shift in this way. Another way you can think about it is take a clock, right? If you're stuck in a negative thought pattern, one thing you can start thinking about is like, okay, I'm going to check in on this thought every 15 minutes. Like, if it still exists in 15 minutes, then I need to come back and actually think and reframe my thinking again. What's it look like in 30 minutes? What's it look like in 45 minutes? What's it look like in an hour? So reshifting that and then having a mechanism by which you actually pause and think about your thoughts becomes really, really important. Yeah, Wendy, I love that. Find the small wins. Absolutely. Sometimes it's just pausing and finding the small wins because they lead to a shift in our thoughts, that lead to a shift in our feelings, that lead to better outcomes. It's that similar idea that all of a sudden, if we just smile, that we actually start to feel better. And the research shows that that's true. I used to do it too when I'm actually exercising on like long runs. I'd force myself to smile because I knew if I was smiling, I probably couldn't feel the pain as much, right? So what is it that we can do for ourselves? Keep dropping those there in the chat. Now, here's another one, stress reduction techniques, right? We know that chronic stress is toxic to the body, right? We know that it has an impact on our cognitive health. So we have inability to remember things clearly. It can impact our immune system, so we become ill, right? It impacts our cardiovascular health, our mental effects, and our physical effects, our effects. And so what does that look like, right? How is it that we actually tackle stress? And what are some things that we can do, because we know that they actually do have long-term impacts if we stay in a chronic stress level. So here is a technique for you. This is called progressive muscle relaxation. And so if you're not familiar with it, PMR, it's this idea that we actually tense our muscles up and relax them. Sometimes at the end of the day, when you're laying in bed and you could just feel the tension in your body, this is a great activity to do it. It's also a nice thing if you're actually having a hard time falling to sleep, you can do this activity. So what it does is actually you start at your feet and just pretend these are my feet, even though it's my hand. And if you ever try to flex your feet, it's kind of a little challenging, but you just curl your toes, right? And what you're going to do is you're going to hold that tension for 5 to 10 seconds, and then you're going to relax it for 20 to 30 seconds, right? And you're going to work your way all the way up from your toes, all the way up to your head. So you're going to do it with your calves, you're going to do it with your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes, right? Your abdominal and your core. You can move up to your pectoral and your arms. You can even like clench your jaw, right? And start to do some of those things. And you're going to hold that tension. And what it does over time is it starts to release that tension that exists in those muscles, and it starts to enter into a state of relaxation. So what we're trying to do is lower the stress level and those cortisol levels in our bodies so we can actually get back to a state of homeostasis so we feel better, and we rid ourselves of some of those stressful tension spaces inside of our body. If you haven't thought about this, if you've ever used it, drop it in the chat. There's lots of other ways that you can actually practice stress reduction. I just wanted to leave you with one that feels very tangible, something you can do. You can do it in the office, you can do it at home, you can do it in bed, you can do it in the car. careful with your feet because you're driving, but you can do those types of things as you continue to move. Yeah, absolutely. Here's another one, number 5, right? Creating positive work environments. 2 out of 3 educators don't feel valued or appreciated. And in fact, we can talk about 3 organizational strategies. We can promote psychological safety, which we talked about, acknowledge and recognize, and we can boost collective efficacy. So we know 5 ways to promote psychological safety, right? We can build community and create norms and talk about them, right? Especially when we fail. We can we can model vulnerability. We can give everyone a voice, and we can create space for new ideas. Those are just some ways that you can go about creating psychological safety in work environment. We also know that we actually need to be recognized, right? We were just talking about it through strategy number 2 when we're sharing our gratitude with somebody else, but here's a few more, right? We can use students to acknowledge and recognize staff, right? We can use parents to acknowledge and recognize staff. We can do random acts or more, instead of random, just intentional acts of kindness, right? Small notes with powerful messages like we talked about. Indirect compliments through others. You can take over duty or give time off for somebody for a specific thing that they're responsible for. We can get some love from the whole crew. Like, how do we create an entire staff space where you can actually have everyone give and share rewards and recognitions? And then how do we build these rituals into our weekly practices with our staff? We talked a little bit about collective efficacy. Here are just 5 more ways to do that. Targeted professional learning. Right? Less is more. How do we actually get down to those initiatives that are most meaningful? We also want to make sure people protect time to do the things that are necessary. We want to role model specific behaviors, right, that we want to see inside of our environment. And we want to promote self-advocacy. How do we create clear ways for educators to request help when help is needed, right? Those are just a few ways that we can start to think about our environment inside of our educational space. You'll have access to these resources. So I know I cruised through those 3 different organizational strategies pretty quickly, but I wanted to make sure you heard a few of those. The other one here I want to talk about strategy is sleep, right? It's the number 1 well-being routine that we can actually control for the most part that actually benefits our brain and our body. And in most cases, most adults don't get adequate sleep. They get less than 7 hours of sleep. We know as adults, we need 7+ hours. We know that children actually need even more than that, often 9+, depending on their developmental ages. So how is it that we prioritize sleep, right? And how do we build it into our day to make sure that we're going to bed consistently at a certain time and that we're getting up consistently at a certain time? Building that routine actually helps set up our circadian rhythms to actually work effectively, right? We know that poor sleep impairs judgment and self-control, but we also know good sleep is like free therapy, right? We know that it actually has an overarching positive impact on our overall well-being, and that REM sleep actually produces stress-free experiences, right? So one thing that we can do here is thinking about a process for sleep. It's called reset, where we start thinking about our routines, our circadian rhythm and sleep timing, which we talked about. We can also start thinking about our environment. One thing the research has pointed to is that if you can get up and get out right when you wake up and activate your body through seeing daylight, and also do the same thing towards the evening hours as the sun's going down, that we reset ourselves and actually start to control our environment. So we want to start turning the lights down low. We want to start to reduce the noise levels. We also want to start removing stress and emotions from our day towards the end of the day, which you can use that same type of support we were talking about around PMR, right? And then how do we start to limit technology right before bed? Now, I know that's really challenging for many of us because that's the time we usually get our phones on, but you can also set things up on your phone to reduce the color. You can turn it to black and white so you can still maybe read something as you go to bed. It's really that blue light that's impacting our REM cycle, or excuse me, our circadian rhythms that then impact our REM cycle. So how is it that we start controlling for and setting ourselves up for better routines? And this brings us to another one, deep breathing. Now, deep breathing is an active process. All of us breathe naturally as part of our system 1 process. It's automatic, right? Breathing just happens. Deep breathing requires intention. Deep breathing actually does a few things. It actually activates our parasympathetic nervous system. And that parasympathetic nervous system actually allows us to actually start to rest and digest, right? Allows us to remove stress levels from our day. And it starts to reduce anxiety. And there's a practice that you can try. And here it is. It's a 4-7-8 technique, right? You can do this right at your desk. It's where you inhale through your nose for 4 seconds. You're going to hold that breath in for 7, and then you're going to release for 8. Now you're going to do it more than one time, right? You're going to cycle through that process of 4, 7, 8. Again, what that deep breathing does is it starts to activate our parasympathetic nervous system that reduces stress in our bodies. And it's absolutely needed to navigate our day to day. So that brings us to strategy number 8. But if anything resonated with you and you have some ideas about deep breathing, drop them in the chat. There's all kinds of deep breathing exercises, from belly breathing to circle breathing, lots of different types of strategies around that. There's lots of apps that you can download. I would encourage you to look at some if you don't have any already, to actually think about breath work in your daily practice. Really has a valuable impact when you start thinking about reducing stress at the end of the day. Number 8, building supportive relationships. This is that idea that loneliness possesses the same health risk of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, right? If you are consistently feeling lonely in your life, we need to actually activate our social networks. We need to actually get out there and do that. We have some resources for you. I'll drop them in the chat related to what we call EMR, establish, maintain, restore relationships. Here's a tool that you can use. We'll follow up as well. We can also bank time with our friends and colleagues. We can also provide indirect compliments through other adults like we talked about. And John Gottman, who's the marriage expert, he and his partner have this magic ratio of 5-to-1. Now, it doesn't have to just apply to partnerships. It can apply to all parts of relationships in our lives. For every negative feeling or reaction, there must be 5 positive ones. So if you think about establishing and maintaining and restoring relationships, you absolutely need to follow this 5-to-1 ratio to think about, if I have a negative encounter with somebody, I need to find 5 additional ways to connect in a positive way, right? So holding on to that is really helpful. And here I just created too an opportunity for you to think about what is a way that you can actually bank time, just a process in which you can actually start to establish different practices with yourself and someone else, where you can actually set aside time to have a meaningful connection. We know also that managing our time effectively is so important, because the reality is time is always limited. I love this book by Cal Newport. It's called Deep Work. It's how to eliminate distractions, because there's so many in the world. If you haven't checked it out, I'd recommend it. It's a pretty quick read, gives you lots of tools and resources. Some of those ideas equally talk about time blocking practices, effective calendaring, clarity breaks, and how is it that we actually prioritize and utilize different frameworks. One I want to share with you that I think is really cool is called the Eisenhower Matrix. If you're struggling with how to prioritize your day, this is a really simple tool that I think would be helpful. It's this idea of, it's on an axis of not urgent and urgent, important and not important. So those things that are most urgent and most important, you do it right now. That's not always the case. Sometimes the things we do right now are the ones that are the easiest things to do, because we want to knock them off our to-do list. But the reality is, if it's urgent and important, you need to do it now. And if it's important but not urgent, you can decide and schedule it for later. If it's not important and not urgent, maybe we don't even need to do it at all, right? And equally, if it's not important but it's urgent, how do we delegate, or who else can help us do this? So if you run through your to-do list in any given day through this matrix and decide, what order should I do it in now based on this prioritization of important and urgent, we might shift the way in which we navigate our time in our day. So if we prioritize our well-being, right, as being urgent and important, then we're going to find time to do it. Or it might not be urgent, but it is important, but we're going to schedule it for ourselves. So finding time in our schedules to do it become really important. And the last that I want to share with you is about setting personal and professional goals, right? To become 1% better every single day means you spend less than 10 minutes working on something. So if you can find 10 minutes throughout the day to get 1% better, drink more water, practice gratitude, right? It becomes a habit that we can actually engage in. You can use that through SMART goals or other vision boards, but you can also set it up this way as a backwards design. What's the outcome I want? What's the behavior that's going to be required? And what supports are needed? Here's a great example of it. Physically fit activity, right? I'm going to exercise 5 days per week. It just doesn't happen. I need to set up reminders. I need to have accountability partners, and I need to map out a fitness schedule that allows me to do that. So think about it. Map it backwards. I want to be physically fit or well. Or in fact, I want to create better social well-being. What's the behaviors, right? Am I going to actually go meet a friend for dinner once a week? Well, I need to call and schedule that time. I need to actually make a reservation, right? Those are the types of supports I'm talking about. And I know we're right there at time, but there's been so many great things in the chat. I want to make sure you see those. And as we close out, share one favorite mental health resource with our colleagues. Feel free to do that in the chat. I'm just going to remind all of you that there's some upcoming demos for you if you want to engage in Character Strong and related to our tier 1 curriculum or our tier 2 or tier 3 solutions. Those are coming up here at the end of May, but also a new webinar on the importance of getting the right interventions in place on June 7th. We recommend you check those out. We also know that we have some certification programs that are coming up. So if you want to engage with us at an MTSS certification, sign up, come register. It's July, it's in Seattle. Great place to be in July. Recommend you joining. Also, if you want to getting additional support related to developing your school culture, come join our brain and behavior trainings. And we got an upcoming tier 2 training happening in July as well, and in October, if that's a better fit for you. And last but not least, our national conference. Please come join us if you haven't already. Register for our 2-day event in July in Tacoma, Washington. We'd love to see you there. But most importantly, these things, coupled with the practices we talked about, will only increase our overall well-being. I hope you found this really beneficial. More tools for your toolbox. Being able to engage in these practices will definitely boost any number of those 4 overall well-beings. And we'll be walking away into the summer feeling better about not just our cognitive well-being, our social well-being, our physical well-being, but also our professional well-being. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of the school year. It's been great spending time with you. I hope you have a good rest of the week. If I don't see you before the end of the school year, a great summer. See you, everybody. Have a great day.